your weekly tournament. Today will be with a special flavor. It's not working. It's a bit weak, it seems. Should I bring it? Is this fine? Oh, so you're supposed to listen to a lecture by Professor Maher Jarrah. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me. And we'll be talking about Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Ghazali died in 1111, which is an easy day to remember. And it's an interesting time because this is a period of turmoil. Actually, the coming century will be more so. And what I want to say is that in periods of turmoil, a certain mood of skepticism develops. People start doubting everything that they took to be secure and certain. Obviously, this also influences your take on religion. So all your traditions, this is the kind of atmosphere which dominates. We see it over and over and over again. Old securities collapse, and people start looking for new answers. One answer is skepticism itself, and to assume that there are no answers. But if you want to try harder, the way Ghazali wants to, then you start looking for a way out of skepticism. You see this in Augustine as well. Again, Augustine lives in a period of turmoil, and he needs to find a way to deal with this turmoil. At the end of his life, he's faced with the collapse of the Roman Empire. So he writes a major work, City of God, to tell us how we should handle life in this world after the demise of Rome. So Ghazali actually found himself in the middle of this storm of skepticism, and it was a spiritual crisis for him. So he wants to try two different strategies, and perhaps one of these strategies might allow him to find a way out. I'll start with the second strategy. I want to focus on the question of Sufism. Does anybody know what Sufism is? Sufiya or Tasawwuf? Well, in the translation you're reading, it says mysticism. Okay? I want to focus on mysticism because you'll see that both of Ghazali's strategies actually converge on the issue of Sufism. And I think this is an interesting issue. It's very much religiously loaded, so the language is very religious. I'll try to secularize it a bit, at least to show that it is relevant for many of our purposes still. But let's start with the second strategy. I'll come back to his first strategy next. So Ghazali says, one way of handling this issue is to look at the different approaches to knowledge, the different disciplines, okay, the different takes on the question of truth. He calls these the different classes of seekers, again in the translation you're reading. And he says to himself, if truth is anywhere, it must be among these. It's like when you're looking for the truth, you say, I want to learn things which would help me in my life, then I have to choose a major, okay? And then you think, it's either going to be psychology or philosophy or business or whatever. Okay, these are the options available. You ask people who have thought about this issue, right? And then he classifies the people who have thought about this issue, the issue of truth, of certainty, because we want a way out of doubt, out of skepticism. He classifies them into four classes of seekers, okay? One of them would be the class of the theologians, which is a problematic translation, but there are many terms which are problematic. We're taking them at face value, so don't bother much. Theologians, or Ahl al-Kalam, are those who think about or who defend mainstream or official religion, orthodoxy. Fine? And he thinks that these cater for the majority of the population. So they're doing something which is good. But then he says, obviously, this is not a way out of doubt, because they take so many things for granted. There are so many premises that we want to ponder, to think about, that they simply accept. Fine? But he thinks that's fine. Again, this is perhaps an elitist position, and he thinks that we should allow theology to be available to help people find their way, etc. But that's not good enough for me. So in Arabic he says, when he talks about علم الكلام or theology, وجدته وافيا بمقصده ولم أجده وافيا بمقصدي. It's fit for its own purposes, it's not fit for mine. The next school we're going to look at, well, very briefly here, is philosophy. And it's more or less the same kind of philosophy that you were looking at when you were reading Augustine. It's Neoplatonism. As of the 2nd century, when we say philosophy, to a large extent, we mean Neoplatonism. There are variations of it, but there is a whole atmosphere or mood which determines what people think when we talk about philosophy, and this mood is set by Neoplatonism. Fine? I'm not going to talk about philosophy now. I have to leave stuff for you to discuss in class. Suffice it to say that he doesn't take a wholesale approach to philosophy. His approach is more or less nuanced. He divides philosophy into separate branches. He says, this is okay, this is problematic, this is fine, but there are some risks. The greatest issue he has concerns the part of philosophy which is called metaphysics. Again, this is a heated issue. I'm not going to get into it. It's interesting. To discuss one part of it would take the whole session, so let's put this to one side. So his attitude to kalam and to theology is, again, he looks at these and he finds that these are not the way out of skepticism. And if you study philosophy or theology, skepticism will not be defeated. Fine? And we need a way to defeat skepticism, and we need something which delivers certainty. Philosophy does not, and theology does not. We're left with two other major classes. One of them is what he calls the Batiniya, yani the Ismailis. So as I said, the world at the time was in turmoil. We had the Ismailis ruling much of Egypt and Iran, and the Salajika for whom the Al-Ghazali himself was and he was a member in their entourage. He was a head of a school run by the Salajika, which furthers the intentions of the Salajika. Endorsed Sunni orthodoxy, and they were at war with the Ismailis. War at multiple levels. There are several issues with the Batiniya or the Ismailis. One issue is that they're infatuated by philosophy. So the whole kind of thinking is infiltrated by philosophy. When we say philosophy, what do we mean? At the time, Neoplatonism. Okay, so if he has issues with Neoplatonism, he doesn't have to call it Neoplatonism. He's simply talking about philosophy. Then he would have to have issues with Batiniya, right? But again, the way he will proceed in a manner that will allow him to find whatever grain of truth in any of these classes. So he will try to salvage things in philosophy, to look and see what can be saved in theology, likewise in Batiniya. The main theme in Batiniya is that knowledge requires a certain human authority, the Imam. So the Ismailis were a branch of Shia Islam, okay? And they think that when you look at scripture yani religious texts, okay, the Quran, traditions in this respect, then you cannot just read it the way you please. You will have to rely on a certain authority to interpret it. And the one who's entitled to interpret it is the Imam. That's fine. This is something that we can tolerate in principle. And Ghazali himself thinks that we need some authority like that, but he thinks that the only authority is the Prophet himself, Muhammad. So it cannot be the Imam of the Ismailis. Another issue which is problematic is that the Imam starts interpreting things as it happens, historically as it unfolds, in a manner which really diverges from the appearance or the letter of religion. Okay? So for example, if you're meant to fast in Ramadan, and this is something that external religion is keen to preserve, the Batiniya would say, well, it is meant at something, okay? You're supposed to sympathize with the poor, you're supposed to undergo a certain experience. Then if you can undergo this very experience without having to fast, or to fast at any other time other than Ramadan, fine, okay? We won't be strict about it, you see? So they try to preserve the essence of the matter. Obviously, this makes them clash with, let's call the other party, the Zahiriya, the literalists. The Zahiriya would think, again, we're simplifying things, that fasting is simply about not eating the whole day, and you can do whatever you please. So as long as religion requires you to fast in Ramadan, you do it. It doesn't matter whether you're sleeping the whole day and eating the whole night, as long as you're obeying this external requirement, you see? If you go to pilgrimage, then you're supposed to go to Mecca at a certain time of the year. And it doesn't matter that while running around the Kaaba, the whole thing which occupies you is benefiting from this lofty title that you've now acquired, Hajj, right? And the whole thing that occupies you is how to bluff people when you're back. It doesn't matter. What matters is that fulfilling the external requirements, literally. The Batiniya would say you don't have to go to Mecca. You can sit on your couch, legs up, in your pajamas, and undergo this spiritual journey. Again, I'm simplifying. Now, this is the third class, the Batiniya. I had to tell you what the Zahiriya is. And Ghazali thinks that you cannot simply relinquish these external requirements. They are there for a reason. But at the same time, you cannot simply come in, empty them of everything which is meaningful. You cannot just sit, you cannot just fast and eat and at the end of Ramadan gain 10 kilos, right? That's not the point. There is a point behind it, and this is simply not the point. Nor can you relinquish the whole exercise altogether and say, as long as I gain what is required to gain out of fasting, then I'm fine. You see the point? Obviously, Ghazali leans more towards the Zahiriya, but he thinks that something very serious is missing. And he thinks that those who can provide us with this very valuable thing are the Sufiya, the mystics. And this is the fourth class of seekers. Why? Because for the Sufiya, it's not simply about external religion. It's not simply about Sharia. Okay? So Sharia is, let's call it religious law, right? It tells you how you should live. In Arabic, the term means access to water. So the idea is that we show you how to access water so that you can survive, okay? And legal or jurists, lawyers, religious lawyers, simply try to look into scripture and find out ways that will allow you to, that will convey guidance to you. You know how to live. You know what to wear. You know what to eat. You know how to behave. Everything is coded, and then you have a whole catechism or booklet of guidelines that will allow you to live your life and to be saved in the afterlife. This is the most crucial thing. But if you simply stick to the letter of Sharia without going into its core, then it defeats its purpose, like our fellow Hajj, right? So the Sufis think that there is something else to it. And this is what they call a-tariqa. The Sufi, in your translation, it's the ways of mysticism. There are many turuq. And we're talking about Sufism at an early age, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Because Sufism will transform into many different animals later on. Let's concern ourselves with this early Sufism. So in addition to Sharia, you need to have a certain way of abiding with or living up to Sharia. And the most crucial thing in this tariqa is the first step, which Ghazali calls, or the Sufis call, at-tahara. So it's purity. It's emptying your heart so that the acts of Sharia, the external acts of prayer, become meaningful, right? It's like when, for example, a painter locks the door and says, now is the moment for writing or drawing. You're not concerned with anything else. If you're writing and the whole world is on your mind, then what kind of writing would that be? So this is a very crucial step, you see. Another term used by the Sufis would be at-takhliya, emptying the heart. Emptying the heart because a heart which is full of worldly concerns cannot be receptive of God. Once it's empty, it can receive God, and this is what they call at-tahliya. So it becomes beautified by God. You see, so once you're focused, you're consumed by this act of prayer, then it starts making sense. So tahara or purity is the first crucial sense, is the first crucial step. Now, Ghazali also tells us where it culminates. And the term that the Sufis use, which turns out to be problematic, is al-fana. To use the titles I've been using, so takhliya, tahliya, tajliya, where God is manifest in your heart. Okay? When you get to fana, you're completely consumed and absorbed and annihilated in the act of prayer, in the recollection of God, dhikrullah. Again, it's like when a musician, for example, is at one with her tool and with the music. The whole world disappears. You see? So fana actually has two steps, Ghazali tells us. There is a part of it which depends on your will, on your decisions, on what you like to do. And there is another part where your free will is completely dissipated. And this is where you start being attracted without having a say. And the Sufis call this al-jazba. And you can imagine that when in such a situation, you might do crazy stuff. That's why we call the crazy guy majdub. Mashayk? So majdub is someone who's in an act, consumed in a certain act, saying things that no one would understand, and unaware of what he or she are saying. Fine? And this is a part where you're so involved in what you're doing that it's simply you're an expression of it. Let me again, I said I will try to secularize these notions. Think of poetry. For the early Greeks and the Arabs, pre-Islamic Arabs, poetry is beautiful poetry, not the kind of cliches that we've been hearing for a week because it was Mother's Day. The whole world publishing to the whole world how unoriginal they are, how much lack of taste they have. I'm meaning real poetry, right? So if you've read the Odyssey, actually you would read it in 201. It starts with Homer saying, "Tell me, O muse, about the man of twists and turns." So the muse, Rabbat al-Sha'r, would produce poetry, and the poet is simply a vehicle. In Arabic, the poet has his own shaitan, a genie. That's why we use the term genius. And for all these shayateen, we had a valley, which is called in Arabic abqar. Again, abqari. And when the poet cannot produce poetry, he would sit there and plead his shaitan to, please make an appearance. Okay, I need a couple of verses. What's the first word? Stuff like that. The idea is that when you're at this level of proficiency, then you're just a vehicle for the expression of the art. Okay, you might disagree with this. What I'm trying to say is that the whole notion of fana or jazba might resonate with things that we take for granted, more or less, or at least we accept or hear of. Okay? So at this stage, you're in the middle of a certain experience. And this experience is not simply a perceptual or sensory experience, nor is it a rational experience. It's the kind of experience where the whole thing is present to you. It's like your own experience of pain, your own experience of drunkenness, you see? It's not simply having a notion of drunkenness or having a notion of pain, right? A neuroscientist might know everything about pain, but might have no clue about the pain you're having. Because in your case, pain is itself present, not simply a concept of pain, you see? And this is why Sharia, given a certain tariqah, would ultimately lead to a certain kind of truth. Hence, al-Sharia wal-tariqah wal-haqiqah. So this is not simply a way to live your life detached from truth. This is a way to arrive at a certain level of knowledge, the highest level of knowledge, the kind of knowledge which is certain, absolutely certain, which cannot be denied. The whole world might tell you you're not in pain, sitting on these luxurious seats, listening to a lousy lecture, but you know that you are in deep pain. Nothing is clearer, nothing is more obvious. You see? And what were we looking for initially? We were looking for something which is certain. Because finding anything which is certain is our way out of skepticism, right? And this brings me to the first, well, before I go there, I said that there is something problematic about the notion fana, right? Because in the middle of this experience, in the middle of this presence, we're talking about religion, so what you're experiencing is the presence of God, right? You're not just knowledgeable of a certain notion or a certain concept of God. You're experiencing God supposedly directly. And some of you would be tempted to say, when you're at this level of experience, to think very highly of yourselves. And remember, whatever you say in this state of jazba might turn out to be nonsense, or might strike those listening to you as nonsense, right? And some people utter these nonsensical statements. Nonsensical according to Ghazali. And these nonsensical statements have a name. In Arabic, we call them shatahat. Am yashtah. Okay? Am bikharrif. So one of them would say, لَيْسَ تَحْتَ الْجُبَّةِ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Below this garment, there is none but God, implying that he himself is God, having united with God. One would say, أَنَا مَنْ أَهْوَى وَمَنْ أَهْوَى أَنَا. So I am my beloved, I am God. And in no time, the term fana starts translating itself into notions like ittihad, unity with God, or hulul, that God has inhered in you. This is a theme which is common to all mysticisms, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, right? And Ghazali finds this to be very problematic. Actually, if he's calling upon his Zahiri fellows, because he looks at the state of Islam, and he finds that his Muslim fellows are either Zahiris, yani they accept only the letter of religion, okay? They pray and fast and go to Mecca, but they're indecent. Or they are completely detached from religion. He wants to do something about it. He wants to inject it with some Sufism. And if these are the notions of Sufism, then this whole thing is purpose-defeating. So he will have to warn us against such utterances. He will say, let's not use problematic terms like inherence or unity or fana, ittihadu. Let's speak simply about qurb, nearness to God. And he has a suggestion to you if you're in such a state. And the suggestion is simply to shut up. And he says, Ibn al-Mu'taz says in the translation you will be reading, فَكَانَ مَكَانَ مِمَّا لَسْتُ أَذْكُرُهُ فَظُنَّ خَيْرًا وَلَا تَسْأَلْ عَنِ السَّبَبِ. Don't ask why. This is a kind of knowledge that cannot be conveyed in terms. This is the kind of experience which is ineffable. Right? Ineffable, yani inexpressible in language. Now this is the warning he has in mind. Otherwise, we can adopt mysticism, we can adapt it to religion, we can inject a sense of meaning and spiritualism in all these external exercises, and hopefully everything will be fine. As I said, this brings me to the first strategy that he deploys. And this is not unique to him. Descartes, a couple of centuries, 5 centuries later, will use the same strategy. Again, our concern was to find a way out of skepticism, right? And to find a way out of skepticism, we need something which is certain. You see, the skeptic says, nothing is certain, so you cannot be sure that the ground below you is secure. Okay? He wants to take away our sense of security in everything in the world, because everything is dubitable, everything is suspect, everything is subject to doubt. So the skeptic has this main thesis that everything is dubitable, everything. So if you say, I am real, I live in this world, obviously if everything is dubitable, then you cannot be sure that you are real and you live in this world. What if it were a dream? You see? And when we find one thing, is this a question? No? I thought I was fortunate to receive a question. I'm not that fortunate. So if we could break that skeptic premise, and to break it, we only need one instance of something which is secure. One instance only. Because the skeptic says everything is dubitable. If we can show the skeptic that one thing is certain, then this premise collapses. And what this achieves is that it shifts the burden of proof. Yani, what's your name? Joel says, you've stolen my pen. please give it back. And I say, no, I didn't steal it. And she says, prove it. What should I say? I should say, you prove it, right? Because you're making the claim, you're the one required to give evidence. So what I will be doing is to shift the burden of proof, right? I'm shifting it off my back and putting it on the back of Joel. Sorry, Joel, I need someone for the example. And you're the only one we've made acquaintance with in this lecture. You see the point? So if the skeptic says everything is dubitable, then we need to, and if we make a claim, he will say, look, everything is dubitable. If you want to uphold that claim, if you want to say that you're standing on a firm footing, then you have to prove it. But if we break the skeptic premise, then, and I say that 1 + 1 = 2, and he says, prove it, I will say, not everything is dubitable. You prove it. I am entitled to uphold this claim that 1 + 1 = 2, you see? And now, if the skeptic wants to take this away, he will have or she will have to prove it. And this is going to be very difficult. So we're in a very different situation. We're in a very different situation because we have put our hand on something which is certain. You see the point? And the strategy that Ghazali deploys, this first strategy, which, as I said, is the same strategy that, more or less, Descartes deploys 5 centuries later, is to look at our different sources of knowledge. And we're simplifying things. The assumption is that we know things either through tradition or through our senses. So I might know that 1 + 1 = 2 because my parents have told me so, or my math teacher has told me so. Or through intellect, because I've sat down, usually on an armchair, and figured it out all on my own, that 1 + 1 = 2, right? So we have 3 ways of getting to know stuff in the world, either through tradition, being conveyed to us through the testimony or the teachings of others, or through sensory knowledge, like we see stuff, okay? We feel stuff, I feel that this is solid, or through intellect, through reasoning our way towards it. Fine? And what Descartes and Ghazali will do is to try to cast doubt on all of these. The only thing that we need to do to set these aside is to cast doubt on them, right? Remember, I'm not required to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, or to prove that it is false. I'm simply trying to cast doubt on it, okay? So Joel suggests, what's your name? Yes? Elsie? Nancy. So she suggests that I should hire Nancy, okay, for example, for whatever job, right? And she says she is very competent, she is honest, hardworking, it's fine. Now, what, I should know your name, huh? Ryan. I'm not good with names. So Ryan says, look, Joel might be mistaken, okay? And this doesn't show that Nancy is a wrong choice. This simply shows that, this simply casts doubt on the whole affair. And if I want a kind of certainty which is absolute, and now things are cast in doubt, then I cannot hire Nancy, sorry, right? It's his fault. You see the point? We're not trying to disprove tradition, or to disprove sensory experience, or to disprove rational experience. We're simply trying to cast these in doubt. And for this, we need a minimal effort. Obviously, you need minimal effort in the case of tradition, right? It's easy to show that the stuff that people have been telling you are mistaken. Nothing is easier, okay? So if the stuff that people have been telling you are mistaken, then this whole source of knowledge is set to one side, right? In the case of sensory experience, it's more difficult, but not that difficult. Like think of visual illusions. So it seems that your eyes play tricks on you. You're driving on the highway, and you see a water ahead of you, and then as you drive nearer, it turns out that there's no water, okay? So if your eyes have been playing tricks on you, and your eyes are your most solid senses, supposedly, then there is no security, no guarantee that they will not trick you again, we put this source of knowledge to one side. You see the point? Reason proves to be difficult, but he says in dreams, it turns out that I can be at two places at once. Although rationally speaking, you cannot be at two places at once. You either exist or do not exist. In dreams, perhaps you exist and do not exist at the same time. It's a complicated argument. Descartes will do something different with it. But the point is that we've only managed to cast doubt on reason. Yani, we've managed to cast doubt on the three sources of knowledge available to us. You see? Does this leave us with skepticism as a final option? Well, he says, not really, because there is a further source of knowledge. What kind of knowledge is that? Well, it's the kind of knowledge that the Sufi advocates. It's the kind of knowledge which is certain, which is experiential, which is the kind of knowledge whereby you don't have a concept of something. It is the kind of knowledge whereby you have the very thing. Okay? You don't know that fire burns, you're in the middle of the fire. You see? You don't have a notion or a concept of pain, you have pain itself. That's why the Sufis call this kind of knowledge al-ma'rifa al-dhawqiyya, taste. So you've tasted something. You can spend the whole night telling me about how great you are at preparing pizza, but this doesn't take us anywhere. We'll have to taste it. And tasting it is not simply a kind of sensory knowledge, right? Nor is it simply rational knowledge. It seems to be it seems to be the kind of knowledge whose tool is your totality. Sorry for the weird language. So the locus of this knowledge for the Sufi is the heart, al-qalb, whereby the locus of rational knowledge is the mind, its concepts. And the heart signifies the totality of everything. Okay? If you know the heart of something, you know it all. And you have access. So we have a fourth source of knowledge, which is the heart, which is the kind of knowledge where the object of knowledge is present to you. The kind of knowledge where you don't really know terms about God, you know God directly. You are in an intimate contact with reality. Fine? Ghazali calls it a light of God. And when he was done casting doubt on all sources of knowledge, he finds himself in the middle of a crisis. What saves him is this light of God. You see? So what about this light of God? There is a problem about it. The problem about it is that it's very subjective. Okay? I know I'm in pain, so I start demanding things. But why should you respond to my demands? Why should we turn off the lights because the light is torturing you? Okay? Obviously, there's no reason why the light should torture you. But you're in a kind of migraine and the light is tormenting you. So you make demands, right? You say that Ryan is really annoying me. I should throw him off a cliff. And I know this directly. This is a kind of knowledge which is within me. This is the kind of knowledge which God has directly conveyed to me. Okay? And if we surrender to your demand, it's going to be problematic, right? So imagine someone carrying his child under his elbow and taking him to a mountain to slit his throat. What would you say? If he says, God told me to do so, and I know it, it's the kind of knowledge by presence which is indubitable. What would you say once he says, God has told me so? Would you say, oh, okay, it's fine, now I see? Or I have a better blade inside, just wait for a second? What would you say? It seems that this kind of knowledge, revelation in other words, okay, the light of God, can be problematic and can make demands on us which are irrational. By the way, this guy, Abraham, was taking his child to the top of a mountain to slit his throat. And he says, God has asked me to do it. If Nancy is doing the same with Ryan, why should we tolerate the first example and not tolerate the second example? Right? Well, because in the first case, supposedly, Abraham has been sitting in the middle of a fire for weeks. And once the fire was put off, we look into it and we see that he's sitting there happily. So if he makes demands of the sort that God has told him to do so and so, then we have reason at least to believe that he's not being fully irrational. So if Nancy is willing to sit in a fire for weeks, and then at the end of the fire thing, she makes whatever demand she wants, some of us might be willing to follow her. Okay? So what we need actually, perhaps, what we need actually is a kind of sign. Is a kind of sign that someone has really received the light of God, because this kind of knowledge is subjective. And Ghazali says there is a sign. There is a sign, and the Prophet has made this sign clear to us. He says, التجافي عن دار الغرور والإنابة إلى دار الخلود. Okay, this is a prophetic saying, which means that once you have received this light of God, you're more inclined to otherworldly kind of conduct rather than being immersed in this world. You see, if you receive the light of God supposedly, and you start asking for people's money, and you start, abusing people, then this is probably not the light of God. You've smoking some cigarettes, perhaps, sheikh, sarukh, or whatever. But if you start becoming more humble, more virtuous, okay, more inclined towards the other world, then perhaps this is really a sign that you've received the light of God. And again, as I've said, this is really not very weird. This is the kind of experience in many things that we witness in great works of art, in great works of genius, okay? So perhaps we can tolerate this. Bottom line is that Ghazali has managed to find something which is certain, thereby undermining the premise of the skeptic, okay? Now, the real issue with this is that it's subjective, and we have to convey it to others. And when we try to convey it to others, language fails us. This is one of the Sufis, Muhammad bin Abdul Jabbar al-Nifari, says, كلما اتسعت الرؤيا ضاقت العبارة. So the more expansive the vision, the more restricted the expression, right? If you're a great artist or a carpenter and you're asked to convey your mastery of carpentry, your intimate knowledge of wood, right, to someone, how would you do it? I mean, people like this. A guy would smell the wood and say, okay, I'm going to use it for this purpose or that, or it's not fit. This is not wood fetish, right? The man has been working with wood for decades, all the while thinking about it, so he has a kind of intimate knowledge with the material, okay? When he holds a hammer, it's simply an extension of his body, you see? But how is he supposed to convey this kind of knowledge? The Sufis use symbols. I'm going to tell you about two symbols, and then this should be it. One symbol is, again, I mentioned earlier, drunkenness. Drunkenness. Probably some of these guys have never smelled alcohol. Okay, they're very pious people, and Islam, it's not allowed to drink alcohol. And then they would be telling us things like هلم خليلي والغواية قد تصبي هلم نحيي المنتشين من الشرب. So let's go and get drunk, right? Or they would explain this experience by saying رق الزجاج ورقت الخمر فتشابها وتشاكل الأمر فكأنما خمر ولا زجاج وكأنما زجاج ولا خمر. So the glass and the wine has become one, okay? This signifies the merging of the Sufi with God. And there's no distinction. And this is an image to convey it. If you're an amateur or a beginner, you would say they're talking about, physical stuff. But if you're an advanced Sufi, you would know that this has more symbolism, even more symbolism that I myself can convey, right? Another symbol that they use is Layla. Layla or Salma or Hind, okay? And she's the beloved of pre-Islamic poets. And when they're talking about Layla, they're mainly talking about God. Okay? So if you tolerate one more illustration, تمنيت من ليلى على البعد نظرة ليطفى بها جوى بين الحشا والأضالع قالت نساء الحي تطمع أن ترى بعينيك ليلى متبداء المطامع. So I wished for a glimpse of Layla, and the ladies have told me, no, it's not allowable. وكيف تطمع أن ترى بعينيك ليلى وكيف تطمع أن ترى ليلى بعين ترى بها سواها وما زكيتها بالمدامع. The implication is that you shouldn't behold anyone else to be entitled to look at Layla. And to be entitled to look at Layla, you have to shed your tears day in and day out. An act of repentance, you see? But once you start saying stuff of the sort, أنا من أهوى ومن أهوى أنا, it becomes dangerous. And the suggestion again is to shut up, and this is exactly what I'm going to do. Thank you.